Hello, welcome to Property Question Time. I'm Stephen Galpin and this is the programme where you can have all of your property related questions answered by our team of property experts. Joining me today are Byron Crellin, MD of Debt Squared. Welcome to you.
Thank you.
Good journey down?
Yeah, very pleasant. Roads were busier than I thought, but yeah, it's okay. It was dry.
Okay. John Howard, welcome to you.
Thank you.
John, property developer, author, public speaker, mentor and lots of other things too.
You always tire me out when you say that. I can't believe I do all those things, really.
Well, I know, but I never know how to address you properly. So I think
fine.
if
I've had worse.
If I mention them all, we can't go
No,
wrong,
it's
can
very
we?
kind of you.
So,
Thank you.
so that's how it is. Anyway, welcome to both
Thank
of you,
you.
and thank you for attending today. John, you're going to go first. So, could the experts advise on the basic differences or perhaps difficulties in choosing to invest in HMOs rather than buy-to-let properties? Are the funding opportunities the same, and are the regulations for HMOs too complex for the small investor?
Well, it's very interesting, and I think I'm on record to say I don't like HMOs very much, which is a bit harsh because I started buying in my day. There were bedsits.
I was going to say, weren't they called bedsits?
They were called bedsits,
Yes.
and anybody who remembers Rising Damp, the show is about our age. So you know, people try and reinvent this property wheel, and it can't be reinvented because actually, you know, bedsits are HMOs now. It's more professional than it used to be, of course, and the council have got to grips with. The councils have got to grips with it. You know, you need a certificate and everything else to run an HMO now, and it's become more complicated and more professional, which is a good thing. The buy-to-let is much more simple because you're just buying a flat or a house and renting it out. And of course, if you keep that house for 20, 25 years, as our good friend Paul Mahoney will say to me, you know, the average increase a year is something like 5%. There's ups and downs along the way, but over a 25-year period, you end up with your mortgage paid off and a nice investment. So HMO, a lot more work involved, harder to fund because it's more commercial. What happens if, you know, the tenants walk out and it's left empty, which with a buy-to-let's much more stable, I would argue. But the returns on an HMO are so much higher in rental returns. But remember that whatever your gross rental return is, you need to reduce that by at least take off 30% for running the job. And also you're going to have more voids as well.
Okay, just going back on your point about stability, I suppose, of tenants. So in a normal buy-to-let situation, you need to have a minimum of 6 months of short-hold tenancy. Is it the same documentary instrument that you'd use for an HMO? Would they be 6 month tenancies too, or are they short-term?
You can do that, but of course most people in that type of environment are not likely to stay that long sometimes. So although they might sign a document for 6 months or a year, if they walk out, what are you going to do? What are you going to do? So you know, and of course the way round that in the old days was to say to this the tenancy thing was say, well, we provide a continental breakfast. Do you remember those days when people provided a continental breakfast and said, oh, of course it's not a tenancy, it's a monthly, to get more rent out of it.
Sort of service department.
But you get less, so you get a bit more rent, but of course you don't have the stability. So it's very difficult. I mean, even with a buy-to-let, if a tenant says they're leaving, you've got the deposit, but I mean that's it really. If they go, they go. What genuinely can you do about it?
I suppose for the small investor, though, or perhaps the first-time investor, as this sort of seems to indicate, I guess the difficulty is that if you've got a pretty transient occupation,
yes, transient's a good word. Yeah.
Then that's an awful lot of work. You know, you're probably going to have to find 10 or 12 tenants a year, whereas in your buy-to-let, you're just looking for perhaps one.
Absolutely. I mean, one is hands-off and one's hands-on. I think that's a good way of describing it. And at the end of the day, when it's hands-on, there's lots of grief. But if you're willing to put up with that, then the return on an HMO will be a lot better on the whole than buy-to-let.
Yeah. Well, John, you've been with us on Property Question Time for a number of years now. We've had pretty well every question under the sun.
Just about. Hopefully I've answered that one okay.
And I mean, I think it's very important for people to understand that it's a bit more than just buying a property and letting it out. It's a business.
Absolutely.
And unless you're prepared to make sometimes fairly harsh business decisions, my advice would be don't do it.
Well, the one thing I find with people when I speak to them at events and so on is that they're almost too nice about it. They don't appreciate it as a business, and it's a tough business. You have to make tough decisions, and if you're not prepared to make those decisions, then with all due respect, you probably need to be in a different industry.
Sounds a bit cold, but it's almost don't have a relationship with the tenant.
Well, the last thing you want is to have a relationship with the tenant. I look at it a bit like a football manager and his players. A football manager needs to have respect from his players, but he doesn't go out to dinner with them, and he doesn't mix with them. They stand away from each other, but they have respect for each other, and I think that's important.
That's the line.
You're absolutely right. I mean, the football comparison is a good one. Also in Formula One, I can remember years ago watching sort of Nigel Mansell racing, and there was a bit of fuss about something, and he said, "Oh, I've got an appointment to speak to Mr. Williams next week," and I thought, well, hold on, you're that far apart in the paddock, why don't you just... And of course I didn't realise that, I was a lot younger then and didn't realise at the time that you need that distance, don't you, in a business relationship. It's important.
Very important.
Okay, well thank you, John, for that. Brian, your first question. I've been fortunate enough to have been granted a commercial rent payment holiday for the past months due to the COVID lockdown. However, the period agreed is coming to an end, and I just know that I'll not be able to resume normal payments anytime soon. Could the panel advise me as to how to approach my landlord with this news, and what would be the likely consequences if they're not cooperative?
I think the key is engage. It's communicate. So the government have issued their code of practice. They talk about landlords and tenants being partners and talking about a partnership. And tenants, the recommendation I would give to the question is get in contact with your tenant. Get in contact with your landlord. Set out your financials. The landlord is on your side. The landlord is not there with the big stick, or shouldn't be. The landlord, especially in the COVID situation that we've been through, will be looking to engage with every single tenant in terms of having communication, understanding their position, and working with them in terms of a payment plan. And I think actually you'll find more so now landlords and tenants having that conversation than possibly ever before. I think now you've got that situation forced upon us, and you know, the recommendation would be engage, be realistic, set out a payment plan that you know you can afford. Don't go high and then default straight away. Work it through, but demonstrate to the landlord why you've come to this number. Give them evidence, give them an idea of what the business looks like in terms of a plan. You've been closed, you're going to reopen. Have you been open throughout in terms of playing catch up? And also the landlord will be mindful of, we're talking about the arrears, we've got rent coming down the line. How do we address that? Or are we always going to be in arrears? So as a tenant, we need to think. You'll need to think about playing catch up, but also thinking about future rent. And a tenant and a landlord will be needing to make sure that they manage the expectations on both sides in order that that relationship doesn't fall out.
I think we are going to have a sort of an escalation of problems because, you know, 12 months ago, a lot of companies took a bounce back loan. That's going to be due for repayment, albeit even if it's only been interest only or whatever. So that's coming up. I know in this area here, the norm has been for commercial landlords to give a 3-month holiday and then pick it up by paying rent and a half, you know, for the coming months after that. But those two things coming together later
Stephen,
in this year, it's going to cause a problem, isn't it?
It's very difficult, Stephen, and I haven't got a huge amount of commercial tenants, thank goodness, but I have got some, and my policy is if they're bigger than me, they pay. And if they're smaller than me, then I'll try and help them and support them, which I've been doing for the last year and a half in some cases, which is a bit galling, Brian, when they say, oh, well, you know, we've got no rent, we've got no income, we can't pay. And then you find out that they've had a grant, a loan, and some of them have been working quietly when, furlough, they've been working quietly. So not everyone I haven't got a lot of sympathy for all of them, I have to say, especially the ones that owe me money. But how am I going to get it? I'm dealing with Byron, so we'll be fine. We'll negotiate our way through it all. But it is frustrating. And one quick thing, I was on the call with an MP the other day who said to me that the government are very, very concerned about September onwards, for obvious reasons. You know, the furlough finishers, and they think they've done an exercise of how many bankruptcies there'll be in the UK, and it's very high. So they are very concerned about September onwards.
And I think also, you know, what we've got is we're talking about rent, but managing agents are also scratching their heads about recovering the service charge, because we've got business parks out there that are where the service charge isn't being paid, or it is a percentage that is way down where it should be, because tenants aren't paying.
So are the regulations the same for commercial, Byron? So in a residential situation, if the service charge isn't paid and there's voids in the funds that are needed to run the building, I'm afraid the landlord has the freeholder has to put his hand in his pocket. Is that the same in the commercial world?
Well, it is until the budget is and the account is dry, and then that's the blockage. It comes back to the landlord, and it's the landlord's pocket. If we go back to 2014, landlords had the luxury, pre-2014, landlords had the luxury of taking possession if you didn't pay your service charge. Post-2014, when Crellin was introduced, the government, notwithstanding what it says in the lease, stripped out the ability to be able to take possession of a property if you don't pay your service charge. A lot was said by the commercial market at that point that piece of legislation sided with the tenant, and the tenant could then default on service charge and leave the landlord in a very difficult position where they're paying the rent but they're not paying the service charge.
I mean, that's an interesting legal point. Does a government directive of today go back and is retrospectively effective on a lease?
Well, Stephen, this government are on the side of the tenant, be it residential or commercial. They're on the side of the tenant. They're on the side of the tenants. They're not helping us landlords one iota. And may I just quickly ask Byron a question? Can I get some of these commercial tenants out now, legally, or do I have to wait another 6 months or whatever? What's the rules?
So there's 2 points in terms of taking possession back of a property.
Yeah, I want to do that on a couple.
If they're in default of rent, no, and they're protected.
Yep.
So your point is well made in terms of the government protecting one side. Right. In terms of if they are in breach of their lease in a non-fiscal manner, so as an example, storing pallets outside of a property, etc., and the lease doesn't permit that. If you go through the protocol of pre-warning them, communicating it, and they still fall foul of that, then the ability to effect forfeiture of a lease, that remains.
Okay, John, I'm going to have to interrupt you there and spoil your legal advice being
free legal advice.
Freely delivered, yes. Okay, well that's all we've got time for in this half of the show. Join me again after the break. Hello and welcome back to the second half of our property question time. Joining me are Byron Crellin and John Howard. Welcome back, guys.
Thank you.
John, your second question.
Yes.
With COVID affecting all aspects of the economy, the government have borrowed, printed money and thrown everything at controlling the pandemic to the tune of billions of pounds. Now that we have to ensure a complete and fast recovery, do the panel think government should throw more money than ever before at the nationwide housing problems? This would assist in consumer spending, create employment and provide homes for all.
What a question that is. I mean, the first thing I would say is they have thrown, we all agree, I'm sure they've thrown billions and billions and wasted billions and billions in certain cases. Well, we won't go into that today, but what we have to remember, two things, I think. One is that interest rates are incredibly low, so the government are paying it back is very, very cheap money to borrow for government at the moment. But of course, if inflation gets hold, then that's a major problem for any government, because they've borrowed so much. That's the first thing. The second positive thing is that £100 billion has been saved by people in the UK since the start of the COVID situation. And so we are going to have a mini boom or a boom coming out of this. And if you look at the housing, certainly the housing side of things, I mean, house buying is increased. I mean, property increased 7.2% in the last 12 months. So amazingly, it hasn't affected the property market at all. Now, you could argue with...
is that geographically or...?
No, well, pretty much across the UK, Byron, yeah. So, London actually suffered slightly more. It's gone up less than other places of the country, parts of the country.
The latest data on that is they're saying that for the last 12 months they're looking at plus 2.5% in London and 4% in the regions,
well,
which is quite good.
I would disagree with the London, because I know a number of properties in London that have gone up at all since 2014, 2015. I don't know where they're getting that data from, but certainly outside London, so many people with our estate agents we've got are moving to Norfolk, moving into the country, coming out of London and other big cities. Now, with 700,000 people being made redundant, 4.7 million still to go who are currently on furlough, there are problems ahead. And like we said earlier, from September onwards, I think things might look very different. But we're now not in Europe, and that's going to give us huge advantages across the world. It's a very exciting time in many ways to be an entrepreneur in the UK.
So shall we answer the question?
The answer to the question is that I think as long as inflation stays low, they are trying to put more money into property. But we've got to remember that the UK property market, the housing market, is controlled by 10 large house builders. They build 70% of the houses in the UK, and you can do whatever you want and throw whatever you want at it, and they are doing so with Help to Buy and so on, which has helped 500,000 people Help to Buy has. But until you break the monopoly of the top 10 house builders in this country, who will dictate the pace of how many they build a year, they need to build 500,000 houses a year, at least new build houses. They're building 220,000. Last year was 160,000 because of COVID. We're a long, long way off that target.
Do you think the level of overseas investment, in particularly London property, is going to carry on?
Well, that's a very interesting point. At the moment, you've got a 2% levy on foreign investors in the UK now, which won't help. But from what I understand,
that's taking stamp duty to almost 18%.
Exactly.
Isn't it?
Yeah, in certain cases. London is a fantastic capital city, probably of the world for housing, and I think to a point that'll continue, certainly in the quality areas. What happens when things get tough in a property market is the quality areas still sell and the weaker areas don't.
Can you just repeat that first bit about the London property market? I think it's taken me 2 years to get you to admit that, hasn't it?
The London property market is one of the best property markets in the world. But the UK as a whole is a fantastic property market as well.
It is. But it is supported by worldwide investment, isn't
Absolutely. It? London, and probably Birmingham to a point now as well, and Bristol and Manchester to a point, and Leeds maybe, yeah.
Okay. Byron, any comments on that?
Well, I think we've seen our clients in their residential portfolios be savaged as a result of COVID. I think portfolios are damaged. I think you're absolutely right. I think there's hotspots around the UK that have got through this because of demographics, etc. But I think there are certain areas that are probably going to be in a mini recession. I think landlords will have to relook at portfolio strategies in terms of development, in terms of taking on extended debt to try and trade through it. But I think from my perspective, from the clients that we represent in that space, it's a worrying time. I think it's a worrying time.
Oh, look, we did a programme with Zoopla the other week. They just completed a sort of rental survey right across the UK. and their view was they were seeing an exodus from the real city centres to both the outskirts of the city and, as you said,
beyond,
to the country.
Yeah.
What they couldn't define, I don't think, was how permanent that's going to be.
I think that's a good point. I mean, they say London rents in certain cases have gone down 20%, which is an awful lot.
If you take the city centre rents, then they are going to be high. So even a marginal move away is going to have quite a big figure on the percentage
of course,
downturn.
And so many people have gone back home, given up the house, a gill flat, gone back home to where they came from originally, but they'll come back. Have saved a year's rent and gone to live with mum and dad again probably, but they'll be back and probably paid no rent, by the way. It's only like my lot. But they'll be back. So I agree. It's very difficult to judge, I think, at the moment.
I think Brexit as well has impacted. I think certain businesses have taken their employees out of the UK, or told them to come back.
Hopefully not many.
I'm sure. I'm sure.
Hopefully not many.
I'm sure.
Okay, thank you, John. Byron, your question. Do the panel think that with all the extra debt incurred countrywide with payment holidays, bounce back loans, this will lead to a tightening or relaxation of credit facilities in the future? And if the former, that's a relaxation, a tightening, sorry. If the former, will this lead to an explosion of recovery actions?
I think this is very much on the government's radar. I think what we've seen so far through what the government have produced in terms of going into a consultation period with stakeholders within the commercial sector is that you've got a situation where you've got tenants that are needing to be protected because the government are insisting that they will be protected. Those businesses need to be brought back open and trade. Landlords are then left exposed in terms of how do we recover these arrears. There's an interesting stat that in Q4 of 2020, the number of companies that were created at Companies House outperformed Q4 of 2019.
That's amazing.
In a pandemic, which tells us that.
And what do you put that down to?
Well, let's use a scenario. I have a tenant, and that tenant trades as ABC Limited. I've got a load of debt. The government are giving me some grants. What's going to happen next is I can see that the clock is ticking, and therefore I shall now create ABC Group Limited. Just carry on trading from the property. I think that there are, the government will phase back restrictions. Landlords will be given some rope in order to operate in terms of recovering bad debt, unless the government ring-fence that, and therefore there will be a negotiation between two parties. It will be a B2B sit down and discuss how we're going to repay this debt. In terms of going forward, I think we will see more personal guarantors.
I was just going to say, do you think we'll see a greater responsibility for company directors?
I think we'll see more personal guarantors, especially on startups. I think we'll see cross guarantees in terms of companies that maybe this is a subsidiary and we want to become the tenant. I think the landlord will look at where the value is within the structure and maybe go cross guarantee. I think data analytics has a huge part to play in 2022, 2023 for commercial landlords. Every client that we represent will talk about that they will use a certain dashboard of data to be able to run a report to look at a particular business. But it is very reactive in the sense that they will look at something when something goes wrong. I think what COVID has taught landlords, investors, developers, and our market space as well is that everybody that is in debt doesn't necessarily need to be in the category of can't pay, won't pay.
There's good debt and bad debt.
Correct. So I think the market will change. I think we'll have these restrictions, we'll phase back. The government will then advise us, they're due to update us pre-30th of June. I think it will just be extended with an element of phase back to give landlords some kind of ability to trade in terms of recovery options. The courts are fully backlogged. That's not going to help.
No.
Unless they do something with the High Court, which is what's being discussed and lobbied at the moment. So I think moving forward, any new tenants coming in, I think they will be landlords and managing agents will be, you're an investor and you've got a portfolio yourself. I think as soon as the tenant defaults and we're out the other side of COVID, I think certain managing agents will move far quicker than they did before in terms of recovery.
I think so too.
In terms of setup, I think it's very much a case of data analytics, tracking, monitoring your portfolio, reacting not on a default, but reacting to where we can see the business is collecting CCJs or something, moving quickly rather than just being, this is my arrears, what do I do, what's my options?
Okay, and just 20 seconds, John, anything to add to that?
I think Byron's got it absolutely spot on. He's the expert in that field. You know, it's going to be different going forward for everybody, and especially for commercial property. I mean, some tenants are already suggesting a percentage of the turnover, for instance, which we haven't got to talk about today. But that causes all sorts of issues for a commercial lender. Yeah. That's for sure.
Yeah.
Okay, all right, gentlemen, thank you both very much. John Howard, thank you, and Byron Crellin.
Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed for your contribution. Very interesting show, thank you. That's all we've got time for on this show, so join me again next time on Property Question Time.